You woke up with a jolt, the kind of confusion that hits when you've fallen asleep somewhere strange. Only this wasn't just strange, it was wrong. The ceiling above you wasn't drywall but dark timber beams, twisted and splintered, crusted with spiderwebs and soot. The air was damp, musty, thick with the scent of hay, smoke, and something like cabbage gone sour. You tried to roll over, but the uneven straw poked you through the coarse linen sheet, and there was a crunching sound that didn't sound promising. You squinted in the dim gray morning light. No mattress, no pillow, just a sad, sagging pile of straw, with the occasional bug rustling in it like it paid rent. Your back ached before you even sat up. The walls of the hut around you were wattle and daub, clumsily patched in places with cloth and whatever passed for effort back then. A single wooden chair leaned precariously against the wall. Beside it, a jug and a rough clay bowl sat on a three-legged table. In the corner, something snorted might have been a pig, or a family member. Honestly, the distinction felt blurry here. As your eyes adjusted, you noticed the single tiny window, just a hole with a flap of oiled cloth, no glass, and the cold air that leaked through it? Brutal. The fire in the hearth had died down to ashy coals, and you could see your breath in the air. Winter hadn't even hit yet, and it already felt like punishment. You tried to stretch. Bad idea. Your shoulders popped in protest, and your elbows knocked against the uneven wall behind you. You shifted again and winced. Your tunic had ridden up in the night, and your bare legs were covered in tiny straw scratches. No blanket, no socks, not even a chamber pot in sight. Just a bucket you were fairly certain had done many jobs, none of them hygienic. And then came the first sound of the village waking up. A rooster crowed, but not in the storybook way. This one had a rasp like it smoked its whole life. Then came clanging pots, hacking coughs, someone yelling in a language that sounded vaguely like English if it had been chewed up and spit out. You peeked out the window. People were already trudging down the muddy road outside, carrying buckets, baskets, bundles, all before the sun had even peeked over the hills. Your mouth felt like cotton. You stood slowly, bones clicking, and shuffled toward the door. No knob, just a latch. You pushed it open, and wow. The smell hit first. Smoke, manure, wet wood, and human sweat blended together like some sort of medieval incense. The street was just a dirt path, uneven and shiny with yesterday's rain, and if you had to guess, waste from every living thing in the area. You ducked back inside and glanced around. You weren't alone in the hut. A woman with a kerchief over her hair stirred something over the rekindled fire, not even glancing your way. A barefoot child stared at you, picking something out of his nose with dedicated intensity. And yes, in the far corner, snuggled in straw, was a pig, just living its truth. You had a weird thought maybe this was a dream. You pinched your arm. It hurt. So did the splinter you picked up from the doorframe. Nope, not a dream. There was a cloth bundle near the wall, your clothes, apparently. You unwrapped it and sighed. A woolen tunic, brown and itchy, with a pair of hose that looked like sad socks with ambitions. No underwear, no modern shoes. Just turn shoes made of thick leather, bent at the toe and smelling like wet bark. You pulled everything on, one layer at a time, every texture a new insult to your skin. There were no mirrors, just a dented brass plate hanging from a nail. Your reflection was warped, but even in its funhouse shape you could tell you looked exhausted. Your hair stuck up wildly. You scratched your arm and some straw fell out of your sleeve. Outside, a bell rang once, low and dull. Time to start whatever counted as the day. You stepped out again, eyes blinking in the rising light, and saw a cart roll by pulled by a mule with a limp. Behind it, barefoot children chased chickens, and a man coughed so violently you almost offered him a throat lozenge before remembering this was the 1300s. Germ theory hadn't even been invented yet. Coughs were just part of life, like damp socks and early death. You took a few steps and nearly twisted your ankle in a rut. Mud squelched around your foot and something squished unpleasantly under your heel. You looked down. Best not to investigate further. Then came the screaming. From a window up above, a woman dumped a sloshing pail of something directly into the alleyway. You barely dodged it. It hit the ground with a slap and an unmistakable smell, raw waste. Chamber pot contents, right in the open, and no one even flinched. You tried to breathe through your mouth, only to immediately regret it. The air here had texture. In the distance, you heard the distant chanting of monks, the creak of wooden carts, and the hiss of something frying in a pan. A dog barked. Then another. Then a donkey joined in, braying like the world was ending. You were in the middle of it now, no turning back. Just you, your scratchy tunic, and a full day of medieval madness waiting to unfold. And to think this was just the morning. Your stomach rumbled, loudly. Hunger in the Middle Ages wasn't romantic or rusticate, was just hunger. You hadn't eaten since you woke up, and now your body was asking some hard questions. Like, where's the cereal? Where's the toaster? Where's anything that doesn't involve a root vegetable or something boiled beyond recognition? Inside the hut, the woman who hadn't spoken a word to you earlier pushed a rough wooden bowl in your direction. You took it. The contents looked gray. A sort of porridge, maybe, or a stew, but not the good kind. It had the consistency of wallpaper paste and smelled like turnips and anxiety. A wooden spoon stained from decades of mystery meals rested inside. You took a bite. Lukewarm. Bland. Then came the surprise, a chewy lump you couldn't identify. Maybe a chunk of dried meat. Or maybe a boiled onion. You tried not to overthink it. There was also a mug of something next to your bowl. Not water. Too cloudy for that. You sniffed. It had a yeasty funk. Ale. Weak, flat, and warm. You sipped it, then grimaced. It wasn't good, but in medieval Europe, water was sometimes more dangerous than alcohol. Streams were often polluted with human waste, animal runoff, and whatever else got tossed out the window. The weak ale wasn't there to make you merry, it was a safer way to hydrate. Kind of. You looked around the hut and noticed the others eating without comment. Slurping, chewing, wiping their mouths on their sleeves. No napkins, no plates, no second helpings. You got the sense that this was breakfast, lunch, and probably dinner too. A one-pot day. The quirky detail? One of the kids in the hut picked up a chunk of bread from the floor, blew the dirt off it, and handed it to you proudly. You weren't sure whether to feel touched or horrified. You took it and gave a little nod. The child beamed. You took a tiny bite. It was hard enough to chip a tooth and had a faint sourness. Still, it was better than the gray stuff. As you finished your meal, you stood and stepped outside again, bowl in hand. You weren't sure what to do with it. There was no sink, obviously, and definitely no dishwasher. So you set it down by the doorway and hoped that was the custom. The air had warmed slightly, enough for the smells to intensify. A nearby pig pen burbled with activity. 2 pigs and a goat were fighting over what looked like cabbage stems and a pair of old boots. Nearby, a woman scrubbed laundry in a wooden tub with a bar of something gray and waxy. She looked at you suspiciously, probably wondering why you weren't hauling something or churning something or praying for something. A bell clanged again in the distance, this one sharper, more rhythmic. The call to work, maybe, or church, or just a general reminder that time was passing and you were expected to be useful. You had no job, no tools, and no idea what to do. But you followed the flow of the townsfolk, walking carefully over cobbles, mud, and straw. Chickens scattered in front of you. One of them had what looked like 3 legs. You didn't ask. You passed a group of men sitting on overturned buckets, chewing on dried herbs and mumbling in low voices. Their hands were covered in calluses and dirt. You made eye contact with one, and he narrowed his eyes at your boots. "New," he muttered, or something close to it. You moved on. Eventually you reached the village square. A wooden platform stood in the middle of it, and a thin man in priestly robes stood atop it, arms raised. Behind him a crude wooden cross leaned against the wall. He was preaching, loudly, about sin, humility, and the dangers of idleness. You noticed that every eye was on him, some reverent, some bored, some openly skeptical. A child picked his nose in the front row. Another woman knitted as she listened. You sidled to the edge of the crowd and pretended to understand the sermon. The priest's words echoed off the surrounding buildings, and as he reached a crescendo, he gestured toward a young man standing awkwardly beside the platform. A rope was around the man's wrists. The priest's tone shifted from lecture to judgment. The crowd leaned in. The crime? Theft. The item? A chicken. That was it. 1 chicken. You were about to roll your eyes when the crowd parted and a man stepped forward with a stick. The thief's shirt was removed, and the stick came down once, twice, 3 times. The man flinched with each blow but made no sound. Then, just like that, it was over. No blood, no cries, just a rough hand pushing the man back into the crowd. A warning to all. Even poultry had consequences. You turned away, heart thudding. It wasn't brutal, not by medieval standards, but it was so casual, so public. You weren't in modern times anymore. Justice here was quick, local, and definitely not subtle. Afterward, the crowd began to disperse. People returned to their errands like nothing had happened. A woman yelled for her daughter to fetch more firewood. A boy chased after a runaway goose. The man who'd been beaten limped toward the edge of town, head low but unescorted. His punishment had been given. That was enough. You stood there dazed, unsure of what to do next. You were hungry again, weirdly. Or maybe just craving something familiar. A coffee, a protein bar, anything in a wrapper with a label. You wandered back toward the hut, past a man sharpening blades outside a hut that smelled like tanned leather and smoke. He glanced up, squinted, and muttered something in a dialect that didn't quite hit your ears right. You nodded politely and kept walking. As you reached the hut, you noticed the child from earlier holding up a wooden bowl of something new. You took it, unsure whether to thank him or cry. It was another stew. Thinner this time. Greener. You took a sip. It tasted like boiled weeds, which you realized it probably was. Still, it was warm. And in a place where warmth and full stomachs were luxuries, you figured that was something to hold on to. You sat on a wooden step just outside the door, bowl in hand, watching the smoke rise from distant chimneys. People passed you, some barefoot, some limping, many coughing. No one smiled. But no one seemed truly angry either, just tired, just surviving. Your belly rumbled again, but not from hunger this time. You weren't sure what had been in that last bowl, but something was stirring, deeply, urgently. You staggered to your feet, bowl clutched in one hand, the other pressed against your gut like you were trying to hold your organs in place. That last stew, whatever green mystery it held, was not sitting well. Not at all. You scanned the village path with increasing panic. No signs, no outhouses, just huts, livestock, and the general chaos of early medieval life. You darted behind a crumbling stone wall, where some weeds offered the illusion of privacy and took care of business the only way the 1300s allowed. No toilet paper, of course, just leaves. You did your best, praying they weren't poisonous. You stood, dignity slightly shredded, and caught a glimpse of yourself in a puddle. Mud-streaked, sweaty, and clearly not of this world. You weren't just out of place, you were wrong in every detail. Back at the hut, you dug through the cloth bundle again. Maybe there was something better to wear? There wasn't. Just another tunic damp, darker and somehow smellier, and a pair of hose with a hole in the heel the size of a walnut. Still, you pulled them on and laced up the same stiff leather shoes. Your original clothes were long gone now, swallowed by whatever magic or misfortune had brought you here. You tied a piece of twine around your waist, since belts seemed to be in short supply, and stepped outside again. It was time to face the world, dressed like someone halfway through a community theater production of Peasants the Musical. But the others didn't seem to notice. Everyone wore the same rough wool, in various shades of gray, brown, and muted green. The rich colors you might associate with medieval fashion were reserved for those who actually had money. You, meanwhile, looked like you'd lost a wrestling match with a hay bale. Across the lane, a group of women hunched over a stream, scrubbing fabric on flat stones. One of them caught sight of you and smirked. "New boy's already stained his leggings," she muttered, loud enough for the others to hear. They burst into laughter, but it didn't feel cruel, just the everyday camaraderie of people too tired to be mean. Your shoes were already soaked through. Medieval footwear, you were learning fast, was barely more than leather socks. The thin soles let every rock jab through, and your toes were starting to feel like they'd been tenderized. No left or right shoe, just shove your foot in and hope. And then there were the smells. Not the dramatic ones like burning tar or chamber pots. No, it was the background scent that got you: old wool, dried sweat, wet straw, and the faint coppery tang of blood from where, you couldn't say. A man passed you wearing what looked like layers of potato sacks tied with rope. His boots were wrapped in strips of fur. He gave you a once-over, then sniffed. "You'll get used to the itch," he muttered, scratching his neck with all 5 fingers like he was trying to remove the top layer of skin. You scratched your own arm and froze. Lice. You saw one, tiny, fast, and determined, crawling near your elbow like it owned the place. Your stomach turned again, but for a different reason this time. You slapped at it. Too late. It vanished into the folds of your sleeve. You shook out your tunic, now deeply suspicious of every seam and thread. And yet this was normal. Hygiene in the medieval world was a different game entirely. Baths weren't rare, they were luxuries. Most peasants cleaned themselves once or twice a year, tops. Public bathhouses existed in some towns, but the average villager scrubbed only the essentials, and usually with cold water. Soap, made from animal fat and lye, smelled like misery and made your hands feel like bark. Your hair was greasy already. You could feel it clumping in strange directions. No brush, no comb, no mirrors that worked, just fingers and a prayer. You ran your hands through it and came away with a bit of straw and something that might have been an egg, hopefully chicken. Further down the road, you passed a tannery. You knew it was a tannery not because of a sign, but because the stench hit you like a physical slap. Rotted flesh, urine-soaked hides, and piles of bark used in the tanning process. Workers stood in ankle-deep pits of foul brown liquid, stirring hides with long poles. One waved at you with a cheerful mornin', and hands so stained it looked like he'd been dipping them in tea for weeks. Just past that was the cobbler's stall. A low wooden lean-to packed with strips of leather, scraps of fur, and the thud-thud of a man hammering a sole into place. He looked up briefly and grunted. "Shoes hurt, don't they?" he said without waiting for a reply. "You'll grow into 'em, or your feet'll give up." You wanted to ask for better ones, but you had nothing to trade. No coins, no chickens, not even a decent pair of socks. So you nodded and moved on. By late morning, the sun had begun to bake the mud into a crust. Dust rose from the road, mixing with animal droppings and the occasional burst of ash from cooking fires. You could feel your skin tightening from the wind and grime. Your teeth felt fuzzy. You longed for a toothbrush. You would have settled for a stick and some mint leaves. One old woman offered you a smile and a small clay vial of something she called tooth powder. It smelled like charcoal and cloves. You mimed brushing your teeth with your finger and nearly gagged. Better than nothing, but just barely. In a nearby field, people toiled with scythes and wooden rakes. A teenage girl had blisters the size of coins on her hands. A boy coughed as he lifted bundles of wheat. His back bent too soon for his age. There was no safety gear, no gloves, no water breaks, just labor until your body quieter you did. And still, they worked. One man, probably in his 40s but looking 60, sang softly as he sharpened his scythe. A surprisingly sweet tune. Melancholy but beautiful. You stood there listening for a while, letting the rhythm sink in. That's when a flea bit your ankle. You slapped at it, missed, and realized it wouldn't be the last one today. By midday, you were sweating through layers of rough wool, and your feet were starting to resemble overripe fruit, soggy, sore, and bruised in more places than you could count. You didn't want to sit down for fear you might not get back up. But the village kept moving, and so did you, pulled forward by the vague, unspoken rule that idleness drew attention, and not the good kind. You passed a group of older men huddled around a wagon axle, arguing in thick dialects over what angle would prevent it from snapping again. One gestured with a carved wooden pipe, another spat into the dirt and cursed the blacksmith, who wasn't there to defend himself. The wagon itself was a relic of splintered wood and iron patches, held together by prayer and thick rope. You kept walking, ears burning slightly from the way one of the men squinted at you, sizing you up like you might be volunteered for manual labor if you lingered too long. Behind the smithy, an open fire blazed beneath a huge iron cauldron suspended from a timber tripod. Around it stood 3 women and 1 elderly man, all of them covered in soot and grease. You realized you were looking at the village's communal soap-making effort. Animal fat bubbled in the cauldron's oily depths, mixed with lye ash, urine, and strong-smelling herbs. It was a local necessity. You nodded politely and moved away quickly, the smell clinging to your nostrils. You hoped for a quiet spot, somewhere shaded just for a moment. You found it behind a small chapel at the edge of the village. Stone walls, arched door, modest wooden cross above. A priest stood outside, pale and hunched, speaking gently with a woman holding a limp bundle in her arms. It took you a moment to realize it was a baby. The priest made the sign of the cross, murmured Latin, and dipped his fingers in a bowl of water. Baptismor may be last rites. You looked away. Death, it seemed, was always just nearby. In medieval Europe, infant mortality was tragically common. You remembered enough history to know that 1 in 3 children might not live past age 5. Disease, poor sanitation, accidents, malnutrition, it didn't take much. Every life was a gamble. Every child born was both a hope and a fear. You sat on a stone bench near the chapel wall and leaned back, letting the coolness seep into your shoulders. For a few breaths, it was almost peaceful. You could hear birds above, the trickle of a stream, the occasional creak of wagon wheels in the distance. But the peace was short-lived. A bell rang again. Not the sharp call of the church or the slow clang of labor. This was faster, louder, urgent. People emerged from houses and huts, eyes narrowing, ears tilting toward the sound. You stood, heart climbing into your throat. A young boy came running down the lane, breathless. "Fire!" he gasped. "By the granary!" Suddenly everyone was moving. Buckets appeared from nowhere. People ran with rags, with blankets soaked in water, shouting for help. You ran too, though you didn't know where or how you could help. But in the Middle Ages, if one building caught fire, the whole town could vanish in minutes. The granary was a low stone structure near the edge of the fields, and smoke now poured from its thatched roof. Sparks leapt into the sky, carried on dry summer wind. A man tossed a full bucket at the flames, but it barely made a dent. Others began beating the thatch with wet cloaks, trying to smother the fire before it spread. You grabbed a bucket and joined the line, hands burning from the rope handle. The water was heavy, sloshing with every step, and by the time you reached the front of the line, half of it had spilled. You threw the rest at the flames, more out of ritual than effect. Smoke burned your eyes. You coughed hard, chest tight and raw. A woman beside you hurled her pail and immediately turned back for more. Eventually, the flames began to die. The roof had collapsed, but the fire hadn't reached the grain bins, which meant the village's food supply was barely saved. You sank to your knees, panting, arms shaking. No fire trucks, no water mains, just people, buckets, and panic. "Someone must have left the oil lamp burning," a man said bitterly, wiping sweat and soot from his forehead with a blackened sleeve. "Or rats," another muttered. "Always the rats." Either way, it was a reminder. In a world of wood, straw, and open flame, a single mistake could end the winter before it began. As the crowd began to disperse, a shrill voice rang out, "Thief!" You turned to see a woman storming down the lane, one arm raised and the other clutching a bundle of herbs. She jabbed her finger toward a young man, barefoot, ragged, face pale with panic. "He took from my garden," she yelled. "That's my sage and my turnips." The villagers closed in fast. Not angrily exactly, but with a tired kind of judgment, like they already knew how this would go. A tall man in a fur-trimmed vest stepped forward. You'd seen him earlier, standing near the chapel, likely the reeve, or headman. He spoke with slow authority. "You took food?" The young man swallowed hard. "I was hungry," the reeve nodded. "And now you'll pay for it. No jail, no formal trial. Just a short process witnessed by the village. A fine if he could pay it. If not, stocks." Public shame was punishment enough for most small crimes. Soon, the thief was locked in a set of wooden stocks outside the market square, wrists and neck held tight. Children threw clumps of wet straw. One woman muttered something as she passed and spat near his feet. The quirky moment? A goose waddled by, paused, and pecked the man on the toe. Hard. He yelped. The children laughed. The goose looked smug. Back behind the chapel, the sun was starting to dip lower. Your arms still trembled from the bucket work, your legs wobbled from too much walking, and your clothes were now stained with sweat, soot, and something suspiciously sticky. You sat down again, trying not to think about fleas, rats, or the painful truth that you still hadn't seen a proper bed. The light was fading fast now, the sky streaked with smudges of orange and smoky violet. Somewhere a dog barked short, urgent, then quiet again. You stood up slowly, knees creaking in ways they hadn't before, and headed toward the only place that still looked busy, the small market square at the village's center. Wooden stalls, half covered with tattered canvas, still clung to the edges of the square. Most of the goods were already packed away or picked over. Whatever vegetables were left looked wrinkled and tired, like they'd given up around noon. A woman offered you a bruised turnip for 2 coppers. You didn't have coppers. You didn't have anything. So you nodded, pretending to consider, and kept walking. In the middle of the square, a man played a 2-stringed instrument with more enthusiasm than accuracy. A few children danced, though one tripped and fell into a mud patch, bursting into tears. His older sister, maybe 10, picked him up without a word, brushed him off with a leaf, and went back to watching the music. That's when you noticed the notice board, or what passed for one. A square plank nailed to a post, covered in scraps of waxed parchment, faded ink, and the occasional smear of what you hoped was only mud. You stepped closer. Most of it was local. A sheep gone missing, a barrel of salted herring for sale. One announcement warned that the Lord's men would be collecting taxes at the end of the month: grain, cloth, labor if necessary. Then your eyes landed on a larger sheet, sealed with red wax. A call to arms. By order of the local baron, all able-bodied men over 14 were to present themselves for muster. A minor feud with a neighboring landholder had escalated. Archers, swordsmen, even those with just pitchforks were required. It wasn't a war, not exactly. Just a skirmish. Just another spark in a long history of petty medieval turf battles. You stepped back, throat dry. You weren't from here. You weren't even sure what year it was. But you looked like one of them now tunic hose and alland. If the reeve or one of the guards decided to point at you and say, "You there," you weren't sure you'd have a choice. Suddenly, the casual chaos of the market took on a new weight. Everyone here might be forced into violence in the next few days. The old man carving spoons, the teenage girl selling onions, even the piper still grinning as he hit a sour note. There was a moment of quiet as a group of soldiers, 4 of them, cloaked in the baron's dull gray colors, rode slowly into the square. They weren't armored like knights. These were retainers, perhaps local militia, hardened, sharp-eyed, with swords at their belts and travel dirt on their cloaks. One of them called out, reading the same notice aloud, heads bowed. No protests, no outrage. This was simply life here. Your lord called, and you went. Or you didn't and faced far worse consequences. You slipped away from the square, heart hammering, back toward the edges of the village where fences leaned and gardens shrank into shadows. You passed a cottage where candlelight flickered through a greasy window. Inside, someone sang softly. A lullaby, maybe, though the melody was oddly haunting. You stopped for a moment, letting the sound wash over you. It was beautiful. Yes, but in a weary, mournful sort of way. The kind of song that understood that tomorrow could change everything. As darkness thickened, fires bloomed around the village. Not wild, desperate flames like the one at the granary, but controlled domestic ones, cooking fires, hearths, flickering torches set in iron brackets. You smelled baking bread and something meatier, probably rabbit, or at least hopeful rabbit. You found yourself following a small group of villagers to the local tavern, if it could be called that. A low, timber-framed building with smoke curling from its roof and laughter leaking through the door. You hesitated, then stepped inside. The tavern was warm and loud, packed shoulder to shoulder with villagers. A central fire pit glowed orange, casting strange shadows across the timbered walls. People held crude ceramic mugs filled with weak ale or small beer, barely fermented, low in alcohol, but safer than the local water. A woman with a tray full of steaming bowls wove through the crowd, barking orders and insults in equal measure. You managed to slide onto a bench near a group of farmhands, who nodded politely, though none invited conversation. They were too busy eating, drinking, and keeping their elbows off the table, which looked sticky enough to be a health hazard all on its own. The tavern keeper passed by, glanced at your empty hands, and grunted. "You got coin?" he asked. You hesitated. Didn't think so. He tossed a crust of bread at you anyway, hard and stale but edible. "Next time, bring something worth trading." And just like that, you were part of the scene. A man stood on a low stool at the other end of the room and launched into a story about a knight who'd slain a beast the size of a hay cart, only to be undone by a goat. The details got fuzzier as the ale flowed, but everyone laughed, and someone banged a spoon against a mug in applause. You looked around at the faces, dirty, tired, weathered, and realized that despite the danger, the filth, the aching bones and missing teeth, there was something here. A kind of closeness, a survival bond. Everyone had nearly lost something today. Everyone still showed up. A rat scurried under the table. No one flinched. Quirky fact of the evening, one man wore a necklace made of teeth not human, thankfully, but pig. He claimed it kept away evil spirits. Another villager called him mad. The pig-tooth man just shrugged and said, "Hasn't failed me yet." You left before the ale turned to shouting. The cool air outside felt like a slap after the heat of the tavern. A low mist had begun to settle over the fields, curling through the lanes like a ghost with nothing better to do. You wrapped your arms around yourself and walked slowly toward the edge of the village, unsure where you were going. Sleep tugged at you, but the thought of lying on a flea-infested pile of straw didn't exactly call to you like a lullaby. Somewhere in the trees beyond the fields, an owl hooted once. You stopped, listened, then kept walking. Night in the medieval countryside was a thing unto itself, thick, absolute, and alive with unfamiliar sounds. There were no streetlights, no flickering neon, just the dim orange glow of hearth fires and torchlight bleeding faintly from windows, barely piercing the fog that now hugged the fields. The stars above were brilliant, cold and unblinking, but you couldn't appreciate them properly while tripping over every exposed root and rock along the path. You didn't know where you were heading exactly. The village was behind you now, the tavern sounds fading, replaced by the soft chorus of crickets, frogs, and the occasional rustle of something larger in the brush. You tried not to think too hard about that last one. Eventually you spotted a lopsided wooden structure nestled beside a low stone wall, a barn or maybe an abandoned storehouse. Its door hung on one hinge and the roof sagged like a tired spine, but it was dry inside, mostly. You ducked in and found a corner where straw had been piled long ago. It smelled musty, but it was better than nothing. You lay down, trying to get comfortable against the crinkling itch of hay and the chill in the air. The night pressed in. You weren't alone. You heard at first a soft whimper, almost human, then a rustle of straw from the opposite corner. You sat up quickly, heart knocking in your chest. A figure shifted in the dark, small, shivering. A child? No, just a bundle of limbs and fur. A dog, or a dog-shaped thing. It looked as startled as you felt, eyes catching the moonlight through a gap in the wall. You both stared at each other for a few seconds, then mutually decided you were not threats. It curled back up, and you lay down again, oddly reassured by its presence. You managed to fall asleep. For an hour. Then came the scratching. Not from the dog, from the walls. Tiny claws skittering across wood and stone, sometimes overhead. You groaned softly, pulling your tunic tighter around you. Rats. Probably dozens of them. You tried to ignore the pitter-patter, but one particularly bold rodent ran over your foot, and that was the end of that. Sleep was not a guaranteed luxury in the Middle Ages. Between lice, cold, bedbugs, and hunger pangs, even the wealthiest often woke several times a night. You now understood this on a very personal level. You stumbled out into the night again. The fog had thickened. You couldn't see the village anymore, and you realized with a dull pang that you were lost. The field you thought you'd crossed was now a marshy stretch of muck and thistles. You took one step and your foot sank into something soft and wet. Too late to go back. You pushed forward. A sound reached you chanting, distant and low. You turned your head, ears straining. There it was again. Rhythmic, male voices. Latin, maybe? You followed it. Eventually, the fog parted slightly to reveal another building, this one made of stone and surprisingly well kept. A monastery, or perhaps a priory. The source of the sound was a small group of monks standing in the courtyard, holding candles and singing what must have been a midnight prayer. You watched silently, unsure if you were allowed to be there, unsure if you were even real anymore. It felt like a dream. Then one of them noticed you. A younger monk, barely out of boyhood, walked over. His face was calm, kind, and unafraid. "Traveler?" he asked, not unkindly. You nodded. He beckoned you gently toward a side door and offered a crust of bread and a small cup of something warm barley broth. Thin, but welcome. You drank slowly. The monk didn't ask questions, just waited, patient as stone. Inside the priory, the walls were covered in tapestries faded by candle smoke. The air smelled like wax, dust, and old paper. You noticed shelves of manuscripts, guarded more carefully than gold. A single scribe sat hunched at a lectern, copying by hand a text in delicate script. You watched, mesmerized, as the goose-feather quill scratched across parchment made from stretched animal skin. He dipped the quill into ink made from crushed oak galls and iron salts. The lines were clean, the letters uniform. You realized you were witnessing a sacred process, the transmission of knowledge in a world without printing presses. Each book took months, sometimes years, to finish. A bell rang softly again, and the monks disappeared back into their cells. You were shown a small storeroom with a pile of folded blankets and a straw pallet. It was the warmest, quietest place you'd been all day. You curled up under the rough wool and finally fell into something like sleep. But not for long. A few hours later, a rooster crowed somewhere far off but loud enough to cut through stone. You blinked awake, your limbs stiff, your back aching. The monk who had greeted you before was already gone. You stepped back outside into the pale blue light of pre-dawn and began walking back toward the village. Along the road, you passed a corpse. It lay half hidden in the brushmail, middle-aged, dressed in what might have once been decent cloth. No wounds, just gone. His face was already slack, his hands curled like dry leaves. No one had found him, or maybe no one had bothered to move him yet. Death wasn't rare here. It wasn't even remarkable. You kept walking. When you finally reached the village again, you noticed the Reeve and several others gathered around a small table near the center of town. On it were parchment scrolls, a feathered quill, and several coins weighed down by stones. A clerk traveling with the soldiers, perhaps, was recording names for the upcoming muster. You didn't dare approach. One man, clearly reluctant, was arguing with the Reeve. He claimed his leg was injured, couldn't walk properly, let alone fight. The Reeve asked him to lift his tunic. The clerk stared. A few villagers watched in silence. Then they laughed. Not cruelly, just matter-of-fact. "Still got both arms," the Reeve said. "That'll do." They handed him a spear longer than he was tall and told him to report back by sundown. The man walked away, muttering under his breath. And there it was. Again. No choice. Just duty. You remembered reading once that medieval skirmishes were often chaotic, disorganized, and brief. But just because the battles were short didn't mean they weren't lethal. Infection, blunt force trauma, even a splintered arrowhead could fester and end you in a matter of days. You turned away. The same child you'd seen earlier was now playing with a stick, pretending it was a sword. He jabbed at an invisible enemy, stumbled, and laughed. His mother scolded him gently from a few feet away, her hands red from scrubbing linen in the river. Innocence, somehow still surviving here. But you knew better now. The Middle Ages didn't care whether you were innocent. They didn't care if you were brave or tired or from somewhere else entirely. They had rules of their own, and none of them included mercy. The sun was up now, but its warmth didn't quite reach the ground. The mist had mostly cleared, replaced by dust as carts began to rattle down the packed dirt roads, pulled by shaggy horses or stoic oxen. You found yourself back at the edge of the village square, watching it all unfold with a quiet, strange sort of detachment. Today, a new problem presented itself. You were hungry. Starving, really. The crust of bread from the monks hadn't lasted long, and now every scent, smoke, stew, even compost seemed to taunt you. A nearby woman poured steaming water over something in a cracked ceramic bowl. She stirred it with a stick, turned her back for a moment, and you, driven by sheer desperation, stepped closer. Not to steal it. Not exactly. Just to see. It smelled earthy and sweet like boiled grain. Porridge, maybe? Before you could do anything, the woman spun around and slammed the stick still hot from the potato the table. "No touching!" she snapped. You backed away, hands raised. She muttered something about beggar thieves, shook her head and went back to stirring. No one around defended you. No one even looked twice. In medieval society, poverty wasn't a condition, it was an expectation. Most people lived on the brink of starvation year-round. Peasants grew crops for their lords, kept only enough to survive, and then hoped the next harvest wouldn't fail. A bad season could mean ruin. A rainy month, a freak frost, a swarm of locusts, any of these could erase everything. And then there were the taxes. You watched as a small line formed near the Reeves post. People handed over sacks of barley, baskets of eggs, even cloth dyed with painstaking care. The Baron's man inspected each offering with disinterest, jotting notes and sometimes shaking his head. One man offered a chicken that squawked pitifully in his arms. The tax collector took it, offered no thanks, and handed over a small wooden token proof the debt was paid. This was how taxation worked when there were no coins to spare in kind, in labor, in silence. As you walked away, a low bell began to toll. You followed the sound, half curious, half worried. It came from the small church at the village's edge, a squat, stone building that leaned slightly to the left. Inside, a thin priest in a patched robe was preparing for Mass. The congregation trickled in slowly, heads bowed, mouths murmuring prayers in Latin they didn't understand but still respected. Faith here wasn't an option. It was oxygen. You slid into the back pew and sat quietly. The wooden bench was rough, the air cold. Around you, people coughed wet, chest-deep coughs that hinted at more than just a chill. The priest began the liturgy, his voice solemn, echoing faintly off the stone. You'd always imagined medieval religion as fire and brimstone, but here it felt more resigned, as if everyone knew they were living on borrowed time. The service wasn't about glory or salvation. It was about enduring. Afterward, some stayed behind to light candles. One woman, her eyes red, her hands shaking, pressed her forehead to the altar and whispered a name. You didn't hear it, but you knew what it meant. Someone was sick, or dying, or already gone. Outside the church, a different kind of gathering was forming. A tithing man had arrived, an official responsible for collecting not taxes, but obedience. He carried a rod and a tally book and was currently chastising a boy of maybe 12 who'd been caught skipping prayers. The boy's father stood beside him, shame written in every line of his posture. The punishment wasn't brutal, a few smacks of the rod, but it was public, and that mattered. Discipline was a public affair in the Middle Ages. Everyone knew your business. Everyone watched. That tight web of social surveillance kept communities functional, but also suffocating. If you were an outsider, you stuck out. And sticking out could be dangerous. You wandered toward the fields again, where a few families were mending fences and checking soil. It was too early for planting, but the work never really stopped. A man with a twisted spine leaned heavily on a hoe, dragging furrows into the frost-crusted dirt. Nearby, a boy herded geese with a long switch, barking orders like a miniature general. You paused beside a small plot of land bordered by woven sticks. A girl, no older than 15, crouched over the soil, inspecting it closely. She looked up, noticed you, and nodded. "Worms are back," she said simply. You blinked. "Means the soil's healthy again?" she added. "Might not starve this year." You didn't know how to respond, so you just nodded. She returned to her work, humming softly. The melody was unfamiliar, probably a folk tune passed down from mother to daughter. It didn't need lyrics to feel ancient. Further down the road, you saw a commotion near a wooden cart. A wheel had snapped, and the oxen had gone stubborn, refusing to move. The driver, a wiry man with a face like leather, was shouting, while two others tried to lift the axle. You stepped closer, half offering to help when someone else beat you to it. A woman, barefoot and broad-shouldered, crouched beneath the cart and jammed a log beneath the axle. "Lift on 3, she said, and everyone obeyed. The cart groaned but rose enough for a temporary repair. The oxen were coaxed back into motion with a handful of dried peas and some creative language. And just like that, it rolled on. You caught your breath. This world didn't stop. It didn't make room for fatigue or kindness. And yet somehow, under all the grime and the rules and the bone-deep exhaustion, there was still cooperation, still music, still those rare, flickering moments of community. Quirky fact of the day, one man passed by wearing a pointed hat shaped like a turnip. Not for fashion, he claimed it deterred witches. The village kids laughed and mimicked him behind his back, but no one told him to stop. Superstition here held just as much weight as law. A distant horn sounded. The Baron's men again, this time herding the first round of recruits out of the village. The so-called muster had begun. Men marched past with rusted blades, farm tools, and armor that looked pieced together from scrap. Most had never seen a real battle. You doubted most would survive one. You slipped behind a hay cart trying to stay out of sight. Because if they asked you to join, you wouldn't last an hour. The sun was climbing higher now, cutting down the lingering chill with long spears of heat that baked the mud into cracks. The village, despite its worn edges and constant tension, had slipped into its daily rhythm. Chickens pecked near doorsteps. Smoke rose from low chimneys. Children darted in and out of carts, playing with bits of rope and bundles of sticks that doubled as swords. You kept walking, every step heavier, not just from hunger but from a creeping sense that you didn't belong anywhere here. You weren't a peasant, not a priest, not a soldier, and certainly not a noble. That meant you were something else, something that didn't fit. And in the Middle Ages, things that didn't fit got shaved down, reshaped or broken. Behind one cottage, you heard the clinking of metal and the low roar of a fire. You followed the sound and found a blacksmith's forge tucked into a lean-to shelter, partially open to the yard. Inside, a man drenched in sweat stood barefoot on packed earth, hammering a red-hot horseshoe on an anvil the size of a barrel top. Each strike sent sparks flying, the rhythm oddly soothing. Metal, fire, muscle, repeat. You stayed just out of sight, watching as the blacksmith dunked the shoe in a barrel of water, sending up a hiss of steam. The air smelled like hot iron and ash, with a faint undertone of sweat-soaked leather. He turned suddenly. "Saw you. You got work?" he asked, blunt as a hammer. You hesitated. "Didn't think so. Ain't much to spare." He returned to the forge, muttering something under his breath. You took the hint and left. Work wasn't just essential here, it was identity. If you weren't producing something useful, you were a burden. And burdens didn't last long. You found yourself drifting toward the river, where a small group of women were gathered near the shallows, scrubbing linen across rocks smoothed by centuries of use. Their laughter carried on the breeze, bright and sudden like birdsong. One woman older, with a braid streaked in gray, paused to stretch her back and looked over at you. "You look lost," she said, not unkindly. "I am," you replied. She nodded, unsurprised. "Then keep moving." And you did. You followed the river for a while, hoping the sound of water might settle your thoughts. Eventually, it widened into a boggy marsh, ringed by reeds and crawling things. A pair of boys were digging in the muck, pulling up something that looked like roots. "Bog onions," one said proudly, holding it up like a trophy. You stared. It looked more like a clump of wet hair. "You can eat 'em," he added, sensing your doubt. Technically true, but edible in medieval times didn't always mean safe or palatable. People here had learned to make meals out of desperation. Hedge herbs, riverweed, stale bread soaked in wine vinegar, anything to quiet the stomach. Just then the boys froze. You turned and saw what had stopped them, a rider. He emerged from the tree line slowly, atop a thin but tall horse. His clothing was finer than anything you'd seen today, dyed wool, trimmed with fur but stained with travel. A sword hung from his saddle, and his expression was grim. A messenger, maybe a noble's scout. The kind who moved between manors and towns with news and demands, not comfort. He didn't speak to you, just gave a sharp nod and rode on, hooves squelching through the marshy path. The boys watched him go, then returned to digging like nothing had happened. Further on, you passed a man crouched in the grass, scraping at his skin with a flat piece of bone. Fleas. You'd heard the whispers once you got them. You never really got rid of them. Everyone had bites. Everyone scratched. But this man looked desperate. You turned away quickly. The deeper into the countryside you went, the rougher it got. Fewer paths, more animal tracks. A thicket of trees rose in the near distance, and beyond it, a low stone wall covered in lichen. You crossed it, not thinking much until you realized what you'd walked into. A field of graves. Not a formal cemetery, just a patch of earth where old wooden markers leaned like tired men. Some had names, scratched in runes or faded paint. Others were blank. Time had erased them. One grave was fresh, the soil still dark and soft. A woven cross laid gently on top. You sat for a moment. You thought of all the people you'd seen in just a day and a half, children, old women, barefoot smiths, sick priests, stubborn oxen, kids pretending sticks were swords. None of them expected comfort. Not one of them acted like life owed them anything. They just endured. In the distance, smoke began to rise, not from chimneys this time, but in thick plumes. A barn, maybe, or something worse. You heard shouting, then hooves. Not one horse this time, dozens. A patrol, or raiders. You ducked low behind the stone wall as the first riders came into view. Male hauberks, helmets gleaming, some carrying crossbows slung over their backs. They moved fast, their eyes scanning the trees and roads ahead. Whoever they were looking for, it wasn't you, but they didn't look like they'd mind finding you either. You waited until the sound of hooves faded, then crept back through the trees, back toward the village, unsure why. There was nothing for you there, but there was nowhere else either. On the way, you passed a small stone building half buried in ivy. Its door was open, inside a leech collector. You recognized the jars, immediately glass vessels filled with murky water and slow-moving dark shapes. Leeches, pulsing and blind, clinging to the insides like lazy swimmers. The man tending them wore thick gloves and hummed tunelessly. On the table beside him were small knives, bandages, and a wax tablet for taking notes. "Blood's the problem," he mumbled without looking up. "Too much of it." You stepped out quickly. Medicine in the Middle Ages was more ritual than science. Leeches, poultices, bleeding, purging. If you were lucky, you might recover. If not, the gods had decided. Back in the village, the smoke you saw earlier had turned into a full barn fire. Villagers rushed with buckets, forming a sloppy line from the well. But it wasn't enough. The barn collapsed inward with a groan, sparks rising like angry stars. The man who owned it just stood there, mouth open, holding a charred rake. He didn't scream. He didn't curse. He just watched. And then he started walking, away from the fire, just like you had. And just like you, he had nowhere else to go. By now, the shadows had begun to stretch long across the hills, and the breeze took on a sharper bite. You were moving slower, not from fear exactly, or even fatigue, but from that deeper weight that only comes when the world keeps spinning and you've fallen off the axis. Back at the center of the village, the fire had burned itself out. What remained was a black skeleton of charred beams and smoking ash. A few villagers lingered around it, but no one spoke. There was no insurance, no rebuilding committee. The man who'd owned the barn had disappeared into the woods after the last ember died. In his absence, people had already begun eyeing the wreckage wood was too precious to waste, even burned. As you stepped around the edge of the ruin, you nearly tripped over a low wooden cage. Inside it crouched a young man, no older than 20. His face was bruised, his tunic torn at the shoulder. His eyes met yours clear, alert, defiant. "Thief," said a woman nearby, not even looking up from her sewing. That word hung heavier than smoke. Punishment in the Middle Ages didn't bother with long trials or appeals. Local justice was swift, personal, and public. A fine if you could afford it, mutilation if you couldn't. A cage in the village square was merciful by comparison, though it made the suffering part of the scenery. You walked on, unsure if guilt or fear pushed you faster. The evening brought smells of cooking stews thick with lentils and whatever meat hadn't spoiled, cabbage boiled into mush, barley loaves baked hard enough to crack teeth. The food wasn't good. It wasn't even enough. But it was hot, and hot counted. You tried to barter again, offering to haul water, stack wood, anything. But the responses were the same. Polite silence at best. Suspicion usually. Once, outright hostility. A boy threw a rock at your feet. Missed. Barely. It wasn't that they were cruel. It was that they couldn't afford to be generous. In a world of scarcity, every kindness had a cost, and you hadn't earned yours. Down a narrow alley, past homes packed so close their eaves touched like gossiping neighbors, you stumbled on a different kind of crowd. Not angry, not working, just gathered. You pushed your way to the edge and saw why. In the center of the square, a jongleur stood on a cart-turned stage, a traveling performer. His clothes were patched but bright, stitched with dyed threads that had once been red and green and gold. He juggled knives badly and shouted insults at the audience with a grin that showed several missing teeth. Laughter erupted, unguarded and brief, as he mimicked a noble with a belly stuffed full of turnips. You watched in awe. This was joy. Tiny, ridiculous, and fleeting, but real. For a single golden hour, people forgot their aching backs, their empty bellies, their lost sons and leech-bitten legs. They just laughed. The jongleur wrapped up with a crude song about a pig and a bishop, then passed around a hat. A few coppers fell in, a crust of bread. Someone even tossed him a boiled egg. He caught your eye, winked, and said, "You look like you got a tail in you." You smiled faintly. Maybe you did. The moment passed. As night drew in, you realized you needed shelter, real shelter. The ground was cold now, the wind rising. Even the barn ashes would offer more warmth than the open woods. You crept toward the chapel again, hoping the priest might offer you sanctuary. But the door was shut tight. Candlelight flickered behind the stained glass and chanting filtered through the cracks. A vigil for someone who had passed or someone who might. You turned back, teeth chattering now. Thina voice. You again. The girl from the field. Worm Synthosoil girl. She stood near the path holding a woven basket with a few turnips and wild greens. "You'll freeze out here," she said. "Come on." You didn't hesitate. She led you to a hut so small it looked like a collapsed haystack. Inside, a single hearth glowed weakly. Her family father, 2 brothers, and a sleeping infant barely glanced up. She handed you a cloth to dry your hands and pointed to a spot by the wall. No words. Just space. Later, she handed you a piece of boiled root and a chunk of barley loaf. It tasted like wood and ash. It was the best thing you'd ever eaten. They didn't ask who you were or why you were here. Maybe they didn't need to. Maybe they just saw someone human. As the fire cracked, her father spoke in a low voice to no one in particular. "Cold's coming early this year." No one answered. It was true. Quirky fact of the night, her little brother wore a necklace of dried frog's feet. "For protection," he whispered, "from evil spirits." When you raised an eyebrow, he grinned and whispered again, "Works better than prayers." Then he burrowed under a blanket of straw and wool. You curled up near the hearth, muscles aching, bones chilled, stomach finally not screaming. You'd made it through the day, just. And tomorrow would come fast, because it always did. Night had fully settled by the time you finally drifted toward a fitful sleep, the flickering shadows cast by the dying hearth dancing softly against the rough walls of the hut. Outside, the wind picked up again, weaving through the trees with an ancient, restless whisper like a story passed down through countless generations, never fully told. You lay there, muscles stiff, heart heavy, but something in the quiet steadied you. This world was brutal, raw, and unforgiving, yes, but it was also alive with rhythms, with rituals, with a strange, enduring pulse that had survived wars, famines, and plagues. When the dawn finally came, it did not wait for you. The village stirred again, as if nothing had changed. Smoke rose, animals clucked and brayed, the same tired songs floated on the breeze. Life demanded movement, even when all you wanted was stillness. You stepped outside the hut, the air sharp with frost. The girl was already up, coaxing the fire back to life with dried twigs and old straw. Her family began to stir as well, faces marked by the same endless weariness you'd seen everywhere. Your thoughts drifted to the day ahead, to the endless tasks and dangers that waited. Hunger, work, fear, and a world that didn't have the luxury of kindness. You thought of the blacksmith's hammer, the tax collector's cold eyes, the thief in the cage, and the jongleur's laughter. Each moment here was a struggle, every breath, a victory. And yet, through all this, the people persisted. They lived, they loved, they fought, and they dreamed. Because what else could they do? The medieval world was no place for the faint-hearted. It was a forge that burned away illusions and left behind only the essential resilience, grit, and a stubborn hope that tomorrow might be better. You realized in that quiet morning light that surviving even a day here was a feat. Surviving 24 hours? A miracle. And you, wandering lost and hungry, without family or place, without sword or status, well, you wouldn't last that long. But maybe, just maybe, that was okay. Because sometimes, it's in the struggle that we find what matters most. A fire to warm us, a laugh to remind us, and a hand to hold when the night feels too long. So close your eyes now. Let the whispers of the past lull you softly. Imagine the flicker of candlelight, the crackle of hearth fire, and the steady beat of hearts brave enough to face the darkness. And rest. Tomorrow will come. End of script. Good night.